Okay, well, look, Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me. I am, I'm really eager to speak to you because I think this is a conversation that's been waiting to happen for a while. We've been connected for quite a while now, and we met at the Sacred Conference at the University of Westminster, which was a really one of a kind event. And I think kind of brings to the surface where so many people in the West are on the same page when it comes to the redefinition of sacred space and trying to understand what the future is for sacred space. Before we get straight into all of that kind of depth, I usually ask people what their background is. And I'll get into that in a second. But just as a kind of preface, I would just appreciate if you could maybe summarize in a paragraph or two why you got into this niche of looking at sacred spaces, why you're interested in it, and what relevance any of this has for the world we live in today.
Wow. In a paragraph, let's do it.
Well, just think of it as like, I mean, why get involved in something like this? Where did
Yeah.
the passion and interest come from?
Um, I do have to credit my parents, which is sometimes hard to do as a kid, right? Say my parents did something right. But in general, yeah, I grew up with parents that were faith leaders, and they were the kind that would meet in our home to start, and then we moved to several different buildings before actually going through the process of building a purpose-built building. And so I think, from a really young age, having sacred space being this fluid and undefinable thing is something that's been a constant thread of just what is the line between me making lunch and this being a prayer service? Pretty small. And so because of that, it's made me question and think about a lot of things and how that relates to identity in society and how interconnecting threads come together. So I think for me, that's been a constant.
That's really interesting. I didn't know your parents were kind of faith leaders growing up as well, and we're going to get super deep into that hopefully because I think one of the reasons I'm really excited about this conversation is the kind of diverse background and perspectives that we both bring to the table. I know you're married to someone who's from Jewish background, and I know yourself, you come from a Christian background. I come from a Muslim background, but we're all in the kind of conversation, I believe, of what the future of sacred space is for the West. So what really strikes me is you've also gone deep into sort of the academic aspects of looking at this subject from a much more nuanced view. Obviously, you've done your PhD, and that in of itself was looking at something even more specific to this conversation. What was your research focus?
I should say it's not a PhD. It's just a
Oh,
very intense master's thesis that should have just been a PhD if I
it
had
should have
been
been one.
smart. Yes. But the thesis was a topic I called Sacred Shift. And essentially, it looked at architectural reuse by different faith traditions. And I was really looking through frameworks of multiculturalism and interculturalism and trying to say, how do we expand heritage narratives? Because a lot of heritage is really focused on ideas of exceptionality, originality, authenticity, words like that, where, an original builder is kind of the historic narrative. And I was trying to say that actually most of heritage and most of history has nothing to do with the original and has so much to do with what happened since then. And if we do that, then we become more aware of how rich our history is and how much more interconnected it is.
Wow, and I really see the parallels there with Shahid Salim, who was actually the very first guest on this podcast, episode 1, who also looks at the kind of how vernacular drives a lot of the cultural relevance of sacred spaces today. And in a way, it's quite you could almost say it's a generational or a very conservative feeling around it, because it's in essence saying, don't forget the past, don't forget the history. And if you're going to be creating new things, if it's a new mosque or a new synagogue or a new church, you can't just start from scratch. It has to take into account the history that already has been. And I think there's something fundamental there as well about, I guess, the nature of religion in of itself. You know, we are still in a society that values deeply, if not fundamentally, the monotheistic religions and traditions, which span back thousands and thousands of years. And I really hope to kind of go through these traditions with you today so we can kind of find areas of commonality and see whether how we are all connected and whether that has something to do with the future of sacred space. And not forgetting our secular friends as well in this conversation. So let's do it. Let's go back. What were you like as a child, Rebekah?
Oh goodness. Is this a therapy session?
Hopefully, if it goes well, it will be a
right,
therapy session.
right.
I'm curious because when I ask people what they were like as a kid, it often frames I think also given that most of the people I speak to are exceptional people in the academic or professional field, there's always a level of relating it back to a childhood passion or feeling or sometimes insecurity. And, you know, we can get deep into that as well, because you're right, this hopefully will be a therapy session if it goes well. I think there's something quite pure there. So what was it like for you?
Well, I read a lot as a kid. I'm sure that's super surprising. But I was one of those people that could read at a really young age, walked around with really thick books all the time. Just kind of put me in a corner and I'd be happy there. My mom actually said that she would try to put me in a timeout if I didn't do bad things often, but if I did, she'd put me in my room and she couldn't do that because I would just sit in there and read and think it was great. So a lot of reading, a lot of music. I grew up in a really musical household. My extended family all did music. I had a grandma who she was actually a very she was in like the state orchestra for violin playing. So she was really talented that way. Another grandma that did like the church organ and piano thing. I think between those two things, that was a lot of what I did as a kid was music and reading. And in some ways, I think that does come together in what I do now, you know, where it's like activating these creative parts of my brain through the process of like reading and writing a lot. So it all comes together. But yeah, I think besides just what I liked doing, I think like I mentioned, you know, I grew up with faith leaders as parents. My dad is a Methodist pastor, and my mom actually over the years has become what's called a licensed local pastor, which is kind of a unofficially unordained version, but works equally hard and does just as much as my dad without as much recognition. So I like to shout that out. My dad was a church planter, which is a really specific thing where basically his boss told him, you're going to live in this city and you're going to start something from the ground up. So he's a really entrepreneurial guy. And so, I spent my whole childhood watching, this guy fight for something he was super passionate for, really connecting with community about it, building something within our home to start. So, that was first few years was literally just our house in our living room, our back bedroom was the office, all that kind of stuff. And then from there, it went to things like, I'm trying to remember everything. It was like daycare, a movie theater, a school, borrowing other church buildings until eventually it was like a 20-year process to get kind of the final built version that they have today. And
wait, so let me just interrupt this. So you're saying
Mhm.
your dad was a church planter, is that right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
the definition of planter, why is it called planter? That sounds like someone in landscaping.
It is basically no. It is an unusual term. Basically just means a church starter, and I think the idea is that it's something rooted in the community. It's not something that's just parachuted in. And so, yeah, I mean, I think for him, that's very true. It's a community that he's spent a lot of time in and invested a lot in. And so, it wasn't meant to be. And I think this is something we could criticize of Christianity historically is colonial processes of conversion and missionaries. And, that's a lot of a conversation. And this, I think in its approach is meant to be very different from that, where it's to say, you're not there just to go and leave. You're there to be a part of the community. So.
That's fascinating stuff. And, I think, again, this is what I wanted, because when you ask someone about their childhood, you can easily and quickly see where the passion comes from. And I can seriously imagine, you're seeing your dad take part in the kind of church tradition. There's a deep level of kind of societal responsibility that you're recognizing in this. And then a universal kind of sense of responsibility as well, because, as you said, it's not specific to, if I'm saying the word right, proselytization, or kind of, spreading the faith. And I really want to talk about that, and, in a very transparent way, because let's be honest, a big part of orthodox practice and monotheistic, if you like, norms, is to proselytize your religion to others.
Mhm.
And there's something interesting to talk about there. But did you believe in God growing up? What was your kind of relationship with God itself?
Yeah, I would say I did. Yeah, definitely. I think a big part of that is just watching somebody do something what seems so crazy from the outside. I mean, literally, my dad was a guy that, people said had a vision and they believed him. And I was like, really? Like, this guy texts me in at night. I've met him. He's a little crazy. Are you sure? And, literally, I think I was like 5 or 6, but he just like walked out into a cornfield. Like, we were driving and he just stopped and he said, "This is where the church is going to be." It was very like, what dreams may come, where it was like, this is the spot. And had this like vision of what it was going to be. It was this church, but it wasn't just a church. It was all of these community pieces that were supposed to come together, and he just like saw it. And as a kid, it's kind of like, okay, dad's got a vision. This is normal, right?
How old were you at
uh,
this point when your
yeah.
dad got this job?
I was early elementary school, like kindergarten age. Um, so
That's a huge job, that to be given
yeah,
to kind of. So in some ways, he's not an architect, but he is an architect.
yeah, I would say community developer for sure. So his church isn't just a church. It's got like a daycare, it's got senior housing, it's got grocery stores. I mean, homes. He literally was like, it's going to be an intentional community, and it's going to be here. And yeah, I mean, it's crazy because they're now continuing to add to that intentional development, and I think they're adding like a whole second daycare currently, and they're doing just a lot to expand it. So, over time, it wasn't just here's the church I'm going to build, it was here's the community I'm going to form. And so, yeah, I do think you're right. Growing up with that being just kind of the constant rhetoric of what we're doing, it wasn't, we're here to save people inherently. I'm sure we could, like you said, theology is something we can talk about over in a second.
Yeah.
But it was like, we're here to be here, and to make this home.
So it was very much for, the use of the local people. It was a modest project. It wasn't trying to, I mean, one of the big things as well you'll see with places of worship nowadays, and I think a criticism that people have as well is that they're more of symbolic representations of people's identity and kind of stamping their mark on society, which of course we can discuss the values of that as well. But this seems to have been something very different, and it's much more of a functional operational use for the local community, and therefore the architecture reflected that.
Yeah, I would say it did. I mean, as I said, several iterations of this kind of adaptive reuse thing. And then the final building, yeah, it was designed to be multifunctional. So the worship space actually can function as like a kid's playroom or community banquet hall. It does have that transformability. It does have intentional architecture as well, hidden symbols, crosses, and different cross beams, things like that. I would say something that is not maybe totally universal in Methodist churches, but is somewhat common in kind of post 1950s architecture. It's got like a wood, like a pressed wood ceiling, or not pressed wood, what's the word? Anyway, it's meant to resemble an arc. And so it's just these really impressive laminated wood beams that come together to form like an arc shape. And that, it's a Christian symbol, but it's also kind of a universal symbol going back to Noah. But just this idea of this is a structure that's safe. It's a place that you come into, that you're welcomed, that you're maybe leaving a really difficult world behind you. So when you come in, it's meant to be safe space.
That's amazing. It really is amazing. And so what stage is this project at the moment? And is the, because you're talking about the inside, but I'm also interested in what the outside looks like.
The outside, from an architectural standpoint, I mean, it's somewhat vernacular, right? It just settles into a Minnesota suburb pretty easily. Yeah. In terms of the building itself, though, so it's got kind of a main entrance hall that goes into where the worship space would be. It's got an office wing, and then it's got a children's wing. And that children's wing is now being expanded into a whole second building for a daycare, like I mentioned, because it had been used as a daycare, just more modestly, like in a shared space. Now it's going to be a whole second building. Yeah, and then the other wing is now like a Christian kids school. So it's like a day school, private school.
It's interesting because I think I'm kind of projecting in a way, because when I talk about when I'm thinking about mosques, and when I'm kind of probing on the question of what does it look like on the outside, it's almost like that's not too much of a controversial consideration when it comes to churches, because if you do create a church with a giant spire and it's got these massively tall, imposing kind of Gothic stonework and whatnot, that fits into the West, right? But then when you think about a mosque, and if I'm asking the same question to like somebody, let's say the Muslim equivalent of you, I would say, what does it look like on the outside? The conversation would quite quickly snap into that mode of, it was quite bold, or it was quite controversial. And it's like, there's something there, right? That's why the culture conversation has to come into play, because the Christo-Judaic or Judeo-Christo kind of tradition is very much now considered a Western thing. But in its essence, it's actually an Eastern thing, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, it started, well, Mesopotamia, right?
Yeah.
It's one region. Yeah.
So it kind of pushes the question to like say, well, at the end of the day, we can bring in all sorts of symbolic elements, and we can embrace a much more cultural outlook on representing sacred spaces and architecture that relates to it. And you briefly talked about your dad's building, where you did use things like crosses and ornamental, and it's almost like, can you really create a space without those things? And one I mean, that's a question I would open up to you, because I would also think one way of looking at sacred space is one that strips away all of the iconography and symbolism and brings it down to its universal value, which is what you kind of talked about as well, where it's a space to come in and reflect. And everybody wants and needs that, whether you're an atheist, a Hindu, or a Christian or a Muslim. We all have that fundamental need to connect with something higher, within or without. So what are your thoughts on, I guess, looking at the future of sacred spaces and the need for symbolism?
Man, need is a really loaded word, I think. So I should say, so like within Methodism, historically, it was meant to be a really stoic version of Christianity. So it was really emphasized that the purpose was the meeting and the learning and the being together. It wasn't about architecture initially. It wasn't about having those visual cues, because the word was the emphasis, right? So it was about what is being said, what is being prayed. That changed over time. I mean, kind of as happens in society, as you gain prominence, as you gain wealth, you gain stature, you start to reflect that. So, there are definitely Methodist buildings that don't reflect this super stoic heritage. But I do think, like with my dad's building, that was an emphasis that went back, was going into this idea of, what are the minimums they needed? The space aside from a cross could have been almost any, kind of commercial, residential, mixed use space in the suburbs. It's not definitively a church. And I do think about that a lot in the future of what that could look like. What are those essential symbols? Are they essential? Are they shared? Are they words? Is that community meeting, is the stuff being said the part that we're in agreement on, or what is that actual visual cue doing for us? And I should say my mom grew up very Catholic, so like if we want to talk about iconography, you visit my grandma and it's Virgin Marys everywhere. So it is definitely something that within Christianity is not a settled topic, let alone if you expand that to what an intercultural or interfaith space could be.
And this is why the conversation excites me so much, because there's so much ground to be covered here. And even just that conversation of, what could a universal space of worship look like or be like? I mean, there are already manifestations of it right now in mainstream architecture and kind of discourse with, I believe in Norway, there's a project called the House of One.
Mhm.
I believe it's
Yes.
Norway, but it's definitely called the House of One. And that obviously takes into consideration that most of the people who require, I suppose, a regularly operational space of worship and who also have the most in common are the Abrahamic traditions, the three Abrahamic faiths. And therefore, creating a space for them to coexist should be pretty simple. You'd hope, but then I think all of the complications arise in what we're talking about with this concept of symbolism and iconography, because I can speak from my own perspective, the community of Muslims that I've been around, and what I know about the let's say the conservative Muslim group or population is they would find it very difficult, if not completely against the kind of the scholarly opinions and traditions, to worship in a space where other religions' iconography or symbols were existing. What is the kind of perspective from, I suppose, the Christian side, if you know?
Varied. I would say very, very varied.
I mean, also it's worth noting as well, like worship is very different for all of us at the end of the day.
Right.
One of the things I always say is, the reason I'm so the reason I am also so excited about looking at the Islamic typologies in particular is because of how often Muslims need to pray. They need to pray 5 times a day, and it's a physical act that has to be done. And the saving grace of all architecture is frequent use of the building, or let me say it this way, that the curse of an architectural project is the disuse of the building. So there's something interesting there as well, because in many ways I know that Christian places of worship and churches have gone through a crisis of disuse and therefore the dissolution of the buildings.
Yeah, well, and that's, when I was back to my graduate work, that's what Sacred Shift was looking at. So I guess going into my background a little bit again, I had studied art history. So I was doing kind of formal curatorial path, where it was big museums, very research heavy, very detached, frankly, from everyday life, where it's 18th century objects that no one gets to see and touch, and having, I guess, the privilege of getting to do that, and at the same time going, whose life am I changing with this? So I started working in adapted church buildings, so churches that had closed because I guess in a way it was seeing my own heritage disappear. It was Methodism in particular. An interesting fact about it is the fastest declining Christian tradition. So it's one of the fastest growing and is now the fastest declining. And so, it's a heritage I have, even if it's not fully the belief system I hold. And so,
well, what is the Methodist belief system? What makes it distinct?
Interestingly, this is part of why I came to the UK. So Methodism is actually an offshoot of the Church of England. And so it was founded by someone named John Wesley. and he was an Anglican minister, and he did not agree with everything the church was doing. He was very staunchly abolitionist. So he was down in Bristol, which, if you know the history of Bristol, huge slave trade. I mean, to the point that he didn't drink tea because he was like, this is wrong. We shouldn't even drink tea, which seemed crazy to me that, English history and I don't know, having that such strong beliefs. But anyway, he's a really interesting figure. And so he started basically holding meetings, not outside of the Anglican church, but he was just kind of like, I'm going to do a little side preaching. And eventually, kind of by the end of his life, people just considered him a totally different thing. So he was a separate denomination. And he did come to America on these kind of like missionary treks where he would come and he had this really distinctive thing called circuit riding. So I think this is part of that kind of adaptive idea. And it's also why Methodism was so popular in the United States, is he would send one person and they weren't the minister of one place, they would jump around. So they had a circuit that they would go to. And the point was this thing called interconnection. So it was, you are not alone out here, in the wilderness of the United States. You have this connection. It's called an interconnectionalism with these other groups that are meeting. And so sometimes they would come together, sometimes they would do their own thing, but they would have this person that would come and kind of remind them of the preaching and keep them in contact. And so, sorry, did that answer the question on Methodism enough?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, I think it seems
Yeah.
more like a, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems more like I suppose, a cultural difference as opposed to a kind of doctrinal difference. Am I correct?
I think it was both. Interestingly, so like the Church of England is called a Protestant religion. So it comes from this protest of Martin Luther against the Catholic Church, because he thought the Catholic Church was too indulgent. They were spending too much money on the wrong things. And if you look at Catholic history, there's maybe some reason for that, depending on, how you frame that. It takes a lot of money to build big churches and lots of statues, right? And so, all of Protestantism was formed as this way of saying, we should focus on what we do, not what we buy or build. And again, that goes many different divergent ways. So for Methodism, yeah, I think it was saying the Anglican Church is no different than the Catholic Church. We need to simplify, we need to get back. And so it's called non-conformist. So it's basically, not conforming to what the Catholic or what the Anglican Church wanted in the UK. And in the UK, that matters because that's a government aligned church body, right? Like the Church of England has a place in Parliament. That's not the case in the United States. So it looks very different here for how Protestantism kind of takes shape. And something that I thought was really interesting that I learned through my thesis, and I didn't really appreciate it here, is that in a UK context, anything that was not the Church of England has kind of this historical legacy of being other. So while, there are a lot of differences, there is some kind of solidarity in basically saying we weren't the Church of England. So there's a historic legacy of persecution. There's a historic legacy of being socially excluded, not being allowed to build buildings, all of these things that are actually legislated in our history or in the UK's history.
So it's as you said, it's kind of an offshoot, or it's related to the movement of Protestantism.
Yes, that's the short answer. Yeah.
No, it's really good to know, because I am really fascinated by the Protestant tradition as well. I think quite a lot of it has to do with the fact that I see a lot of similarities in the ways that Muslims kind of differentiate from the Christian tradition and doctrine, and how the Protestants do as well, which is, I mean, you've probably heard the phrase, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. And it's making that separation between church and state. And I think there is where a lot of the tension arises between these kind of these different sects of the religion, if you like. And I am also, if you haven't realized, trying to get down to the bottom of your particular personal beliefs as well, because I think a lot of it has to do with the conversation. about the diversity in belief and how that can be accommodated. So I think, what are your thoughts on a personal level with regards to the separation of church and state, and I guess fundamentally from a philosophical point of view as well, that has a lot to do with the way in which you see the Trinity in a weird way. What is your view on the kind of the fundamental Christian doctrine, if you like?
Wow, I was not expecting to answer this question today. Fundamental beliefs.
What do you think of Jesus?
Yeah. In all honesty,
Yeah.
Especially since I studied art history, I think Christianity turned Jesus into an idol by its own belief system. I think the process by which iconographically we've linked Jesus to a lot of things actually gets in the way of our belief system that we say we have. So I have struggled with that within my own tradition, I guess, in that I think it became, like a substitution for the things you're supposed to be focusing on. And I do.
Can you expand on that? If you don't mind, if I'm probing too much, just tell me.
Yeah.
I can honestly just, move it on. But this is a safe space. Again, when it comes to like everyone's opinions, this is the one thing I aim to do to the highest level, which is I don't judge anyone's opinions, and I will not allow people to kind of feel uncomfortable to share what they want to share. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. No. I appreciate that. I just was like, wow, this is an early morning conversation for me. So it's fun to wrap my head around.
Get another coffee. Go on.
Just keep drinking my coffee. Yeah. So within that, well, okay. So like I said, I studied art history, and honestly, within my growing up as Methodist, we didn't have statues. We didn't have a lot of images of Jesus. It was a lot of storytelling. And so it's
and stories of what?
Stories, biblical scripture.
Prophetic stories.
Yeah. So, we have the Old Testament and the New Testament. And then within Methodism, there's a book called the Book of Discipline, which is something that is kind of outlines the lines of faith through the lens of John Wesley. So those are kind of the main things that get brought up, but it's a lot of, the word is exegesis. It's focusing on what the actual scripture says is kind of the goal. So, sitting there and talking with people about, hey, I read this, what does it mean? Learning to use Hebrew and Greek lexicons and looking up words and trying to parse out, if there's things that we've mistranslated over time, so it's very word-based. It's not very visually based. And so I think the figure of Jesus is somebody I learned through action, this is the kind of stuff he did in the world. This is the kind of things God moves through in the world. And yeah, so when I went to college, I was actually going to be a biology major. I wanted to study conservation biology. I used to do like environmental studies. So that was like my main thing. And I happened to be put into a freshman orientation course that was an art history course. And my advisor was like, you need to do this. And I was like, I'm going to study biology, but thank you. But the reason why is because when I sat there, it's like our freshman class and we're looking at these images and it's just like, Jesus, like so much of Western art history is centered on this figure of Christ. And I was like, this isn't even, the framing I've ever thought about for myself of who this figure is, and just starting to really probe those things of like, okay, so if most of Western tradition, not just visually, but, in our embedded histories, Christianity forms so much of Americans' political and sociological and, so much of our landscape here is on this basis of Christian identity. As an art historian, especially, how we depict that visually really starts to inform what that means, because the phrase iconography, sometimes that references things like, yes, those statues of saints and things like that. But when I use it, what it means is subconscious visual association. So it's like, if you see the same image repeated in different contexts, you start to draw subconscious associations to those things. So it's like if you see an image of Jesus looking like this in one context, and then you see it over here again, your brain's going to automatically draw a connection. And I just started to get really, really interested in how we were doing that and what were the ramifications of that. Because for me, I almost had to have like a dissociative process where it was like, this is not what I think it is, and how are we historically reconciling that?
It is fascinating. I appreciate that depth as well, because you know, looking at the universality of religion again, I think has to involve going deeper than just talking about, hey guys, we all believe in the same thing fundamentally, so let's just make a space that's shared. I've tried that, but it always probes me to have to go way deeper. And I get, because there's a very vocal conservative Muslim community who, when I talk about ideas, for example, of a new space of worship, they are very, very hesitant to kind of even engage in those conversations, and need the grip of scholarly input. And I think that's a very important concern to have. But then when we get into these deeper conversations, we have to go even deeper and look at the whole tradition from all the way perhaps back to Mesopotamia, and think about, even what you're describing as like how Jesus is viewed in different cultures opens up a plethora of conversation points of for the relevance of universal future with regards to religion and sacred space. Because you ask an average young Western Caucasian child, let's say, about Jesus, I'm sure they'd be very shocked to hear that, oh, by the way, Jesus's teachings forms a fundamental fundamental part of the Muslims' belief system as well. And would you imagine a man in the desert in the middle of Arabia would also be saying, for 700 years or so after Jesus passed away, that I am preaching what Jesus preached, and I'm from the same, I'm bringing people to the same message. And it's like, did you know that? And a lot of people don't know that. And it's almost as if I feel like we're kind of, at least I hope we're doing this, is bringing people back to the fundamentals of where this all links together in a way that is still comfortable for the Orthodox. Because I mean, I would be interested to know what you think about this. And I think if we don't, because what we're talking about are very progressive ideas, right? And progressive ideas are not the most, they are difficult to form the foundations of something which is thousands and thousands of years old. So you have to be able to reflect on what is Orthodox, traditional, and conservative. And it's like, I feel like if we don't include and accommodate for the orthodoxy and the conservative, then we won't make any progress.
Yeah.
So what is your view on, orthodoxy in a weird way? I mean, at the end of the day, like, I'll give you an example. For me, orthodoxy, from the kind of my Islamic lens that I've been taught, has changed drastically. When I was a kid, I thought orthodoxy was like, in a weird way, almost like this Arabicized romanticism of, the era of the Prophet Muhammad, And when I grew up and I started to listen to more and learn more sophisticated and mature understandings of Islamic teaching, and realized that history goes back further than 1400 years when it comes to religion, and then, really actualizing why Abraham is mentioned in the Quran so much, why Moses of all prophets is mentioned the most in the Quran, why there's a whole chapter about Mary in the Quran, and Jesus is in probably one of the biggest protagonists in the Quran himself as well. So my understanding of orthodoxy has now shifted to one which is saying, as a Muslim, I feel part of the same tradition as the Jews and the Christians.
Yeah, wow. I have a lot of thoughts. So I guess I should say, yeah, I mean, From a historian perspective, or if I had the lens on of, I'm going to write about this formally, there are really important words like multiculturalism versus interculturalism that come to mind, where multiculturalism is essentially saying we have differences in society, but they don't intermix, and interculturalism, I mean, that word inter, right, is the point is that you're supposed to learn and grow and understand. Like there's mutual exchange and respect. And I think for me, like that becomes that, what is interfaith? I think that's what that's meant to say is, there's mutual exchange and understanding. So from an Orthodox perspective, yeah, I am a big believer in the idea of there's actually a lot more shared than not. And again, going back to, there's a lot of things or people that assume society is getting more secular. As you said, because white Western Christian churches are declining, people say, actually, there's no more religion in the world. And that's not true. And in fact, historically, religious identity has been one of the strongest ways communities come together, like in the American context, when people settled the United States, they would do so, in these really tight religious enclaves because it was saying, hey, this is what we know, this is who we are, we speak the same language, and I think that again is a commonality. I know like in the UK context with Muslim communities, and a lot of immigrant communities, it just makes sense. It's a reason community comes together that maybe wasn't even that important to you before, but because you're in a new context, you suddenly go, oh, actually, this matters to me because it reminds me of who I am for whatever reason. And so I do think within that, the question of like, so then what's orthodoxy? What is like a fundamental thing that we're all clinging to? Yeah, again, Christianity is so varied. It's hard to say this is the one thing. I do think one of the big tenets that separates it from Judaism and Islam, and that's probably the biggest point of contention, is Jesus as deity, right? So it's not just Jesus as Messiah-like figure. It's not just Jesus as prophet. He is God. And if he's God, then that changes what monotheism might look like for people. And so I think that was the thing, looking at iconographic tradition, I never really personally thought the Trinity thing was that big a deal, right? It was like, okay, sure. It's a big deal in Christianity, right? And especially, when you see image after image after image of Jesus being Jesus as God, right? And I do think if I can think about points of contention, that's probably a big one.
Yeah, and it's a debate that has been probably going on for hundreds of years, thousands of years, and probably one that won't go away. And it's a difficult one. From an architectural standpoint, I feel like we have to also recognize that in the spaces we create. And what that would look like is to say, if we're trying to come to some sort of vision here, and not to say that those visions haven't already begun, it seems as if the best way to do it is to allow people to have a kind of a hybrid space, which is almost non-orthodox but orthodox at the same time. And what I mean by that is it's orthodox in the most fundamental way that, okay, you are here in order to worship, and you can maybe even go into your own personalized space and create your own space to have that worship space. But at the same time, we can never forget that there is going to be thresholds. There are going to have to be areas where boundaries cannot be crossed, perhaps physically and metaphorically there. So it's, how do you create a space for that? And I have crazy visions that, will probably get me into trouble with Orthodox communities. But I think the secret ingredient is discussion and discourse, and maybe a very, very little tiny bit of debate. I think debate most of the time is, I can't use the phrase, but most of the time not productive. but it can be productive if done in the right way. But discussion, I think, even if you imagine like a space where you did have a universal place to maybe just come and reflect and, you know, carry out your prayers. And I think from a Christian point of view and perhaps a Jewish point of view, which maybe you could share if you know much about, given that you're married to someone who's Jewish, it wouldn't be too difficult to coexist in a space with various other people and initiate the connection with your higher being or with God or with yourself in a weird way. Whereas I think for Muslims, it would be slightly difficult because the act of worship, and again, I want to kind of hopefully go a bit deeper on that, in what your research showed about the acts of worship and the differentiation between the acts of worship and what that means for the spaces. Because I kind of touched on it before that, you know, Muslims need a physical space to move their body, you know, up and down and prostrate. And therefore, and also do it on a regular basis 5 times within the day. So it's like, what do you think the future sacred space looks like? Is it something that can accommodate for people's differences, or is it something that is almost diluted and says you can do a simplified form of worship or a universal form of worship?
It's a really good question. You know, and I do think, again, given there's so much of a spectrum within each tradition, you know, myself maybe being more centrist versus somebody like my grandma who on a Catholic church, they do 24-hour oration. So they do pray 24 hours a day and you sign up for a slot and you go in. So while it's not everyone communally, it is somebody's in an adoration chapel at all moments praying, you know, and Catholic practice does have a lot of up and down and kneeling and things like that. But that aside, you know, if I wanted to just say what I wish the world was moving toward, it was something like you said, where it's, I don't like the word dilute, because that to me says that we lost what we were bringing into the space. But I do like the idea of shared, or maybe it's condensed, maybe it's, I don't know. I'm searching for the right word still, but I think the idea of, you know, I know what I can bring from my tradition into the space. And is it diluted by saying maybe that's something you have a touch point to? I hope not, right? You know, again, I look at adapted buildings all the time, and I have so many examples of mosques that bring in stained glass from churches because, you know, they find them beautiful and the abstracted shapes fit, you know, and like there are a lot of expressive ways of showing. Maybe abstracted is the right word. It's not diluted, it's abstracted, right? So it's not to say we lost anything. It's we understood it so much that we were able to distill it to its essence. And I think there is something really powerful that could be done within that.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. I'm about to ask you probably the most difficult question.
Uh-oh.
But I really want to, it's a question I keep asking myself and I'm not sure how to deal with it. But I think I want to ask it to you because you, in a similar way to me, are somebody who perhaps has a progressive way, and again, that word, is it the right word to use? I don't know yet. A progressive way of seeing your orthodox practice in the world we live in today, and you deal with orthodox you know, conservative values as well. I do too. I see a big obstacle in getting to this positive vision of shared space and sacred space, being the orthodox or the conservative practitioners' need for precedent, need for drawing on the past. Mm-hmm. Yet much of what you work towards and what you say is important is the importance of precedent and the past and the history. It almost seems like a contradiction there, because in some ways what we're trying to do is come up with something new, albeit we are taking from inspiration in the past. Now, put that to the side. How do we change the Orthodox's view on needing precedent in order to progress?
You know, I do think, again, this is how I ended up thinking a lot about adapted spaces, because I think, again, you have to have a certain level of affluence before you can differentiate yourself and say, this is only my space. I grew up in Minnesota. Minnesota is, the Wild West frontier in some capacity, where it was, you don't have the luxury of isolation because you could have died. It's really harsh weather conditions. And, the idea that if your neighbor didn't help you, you would freeze to death was real, and things like that. And that's part of our, I would say, a thread that continues in culture today. We have this phrase called Minnesota nice, which is, sometimes passive aggressive, but ultimately like anyone would help anyone if they needed it. And the reason why that matters is because I think when we say historic precedent, I actually think there are a lot more examples of these shared spaces, of these fledgling communities just depending on each other. And I think that's why, for me, when going back to sacred shift stuff of saying, why are we so obsessed with what an original purpose was? That was one person who had money once. Great, wonderful. They might have done something beautiful with that. But I promise you that unless they were so isolationist, they never went grocery shopping, they interacted with other people, right? And so if that's true, then there are probably more cultural exchanges and points of understanding than we're giving credit to. And maybe I just want to live in a world where I believe that there are positive relationships and not only negative ones. It is way too easy to find examples of racism and Islamophobia and, just these things that xenophobia, just things that are the narrative of what interreligious communication is, right? Which is, here are these people doing this thing. I don't like it. It's not what I believe in. And sometimes there's a little bit of just like, get your people, tell them that's not right, and yeah, I guess in the search for history, saying there are examples of different, and hey, what if we actually tried for it now too?
It's amazing. I feel like the answer that how do we deal with the Orthodox's need for precedent, the answer to that being find them precedent of a progressive of progressive practice. That's a brilliant answer. Right. And it does really make me think about in the Islamic tradition, and even the way I feel like using my terminology is evolving. And I am someone who needs to kind of feel the level of orthodox and kind of conservative practice, because I think in most people who take religion seriously, they recognize the need for you being connected with the past. So it's like you'll never ever be able to separate yourself from that. And people might argue, oh well, Hamza, you've seen mosques in Turkey where they've done in Zaha Hadid type things with crazy parametric design and minimal interiors, and it still feels good. And I'm like, yeah, it does. But there's a place for that, and that works for the Orthodox. And that is a place of stripping it down to its fundamental, which works for the Orthodox. But there's also another thing that does work for the Orthodox or the conservative, which is recognizing the cultural importance of the form in which the buildings and the spaces and the culture took place, and applying that to today's design. I mean, even saying that, because I'm trying, one of the things, by the way, I always try to do my podcast is change my opinion. So I try to find people who I know will have slightly different views on things, and I'm trying to change my opinion on saying, okay, it's fine for places to have places of worship that do really express the aesthetics of, let's say, South Asian, Pakistani and Indian tile work and ceramics that interplays with the way the mosque is designed and the facade and the inside. And then but then part of me saying, oh, but maybe the way forward is to say, no, it should be something that is, because look, let me just be honest. I'm someone who has a connection to, let's say, my parents' tradition. My parents come from a Pakistani background, to the point where, like, yeah, I do feel there is something somewhat nostalgic in an abstract way of looking at Sindhi ceramic artwork, which is a region in India and Pakistan, and applying that to a place of worship and feeling some level of connection there. But I'd be lying if I said I feel it enough to want it as part of expressing myself. But because I'm part of a generation of South Asian British people who don't really identify with their ancestral background, and I do really see myself primarily as a British person, and I want to identify myself as that primarily for obvious reasons, I think. I don't necessarily want I don't necessarily want my mosque to be a Pakistani or Indian mosque. I want it to be a mosque open for maybe the British identity. And, we've seen the discourse of the British mosque. And I think maybe that's why it's such an exciting typology, because you can't really say the same for a church or a synagogue. And interestingly enough, you probably couldn't even say that for a church and a synagogue in the East, because the tradition of Christianity and Judaism, as we said in the start of this episode, did start in the East. So the mosque is a very interesting thing. I mean, interested to know what your thoughts are on the kind of the disjunct between looking at the future of sacred space through the historical lens and allowing it to be almost cultural centers, which they did start off as for example, in the UK, because a new immigrant population was arriving and they needed to have something that represented and empowered themselves. But then thinking about people like me as well, who feel no connection to things like that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, such a multi-layered question. And I also would like your answer, not just your question about it, because I'm curious what you think that looks like in terms of, what is that typology? What is that national identity? And, I think, just to quickly say, when I was having a recent conversation around what sacredness means, because what are these things we're talking about? We're talking about sacred space. And the definition we came up with was just set apart. So it's like a place that you identify as different from your everyday thing, which is a really baseline definition, right? But at the same time, that actually really helps, I think, because there's a certain amount of, it when you see it, if that makes sense. Why does that multi-faith prayer closet / chapel / whatever that you see in certain universities or airports or whatever, why does that not necessarily, like sometimes for me, it really does feel like a closet, and you're like, I can't escape the fact that this just feels like a closet, right? They tried to set it apart. So what does that look like, And I think, to your point, there are lots of ways where cultural heritage might be different than what sacred space is, right? So, if my East Berlin family came to the US and said, this is what sacred space looks like to us, it's probably not what ended up getting built here, which was super simple A-frame structures, whitewashed just to survive the harsh winters, nothing special about them. They also functioned as schools. They also functioned as eating spaces, that's all they had, and that's what it was. What did they do that differentiated that for them? I don't even have an answer to that. But that becomes a typology because it's what was here and what they could do. And so maybe that's another way of me going back to go forward, of just saying, actually, maybe there are really interesting examples of when people had to just pare it down to what they absolutely needed. That helps us answer that question of going, if you go down to Bristol, where Methodism started, Wesley's first church was actually super simple. It was really just, a space, white interior, there's a skylight, and there's a balcony for seating. And it's that's it. There's not a bunch of stuff in there. And historically, if stuff got moved in and out, that's a conversation. But architecturally, it's really basic. It was actually based on synagogue architecture, so it's meant to be just a meeting space. And I actually think that's maybe more of a shared typology than we all look at. It's just this idea of it's just a place to meet. What if we start there?
Yeah, that is really fascinating. It's opened up more questions for me now of we haven't talked much about the Jewish practice, and I dare I say it, this is my perception, it could be wrong. I don't see too much involvement from the kind of the Jewish representation in these interfaith dialogues. Well, not nearly as much as I see the Christians and the Muslims talk about it. And I wonder why. I mean, maybe my perception is skewed and, I'm wrong, or maybe there is something there about, do they have it figured out, or is there a doctrinal difference between Christianity and Christianity, Islam, and Judaism in its need for coexisting and being a universal tradition? And part of me thinks yes, because I do recognize that the Jewish tradition is its orthodoxy is much more, we're happy to be our own people, and you guys can, are separate. And in many ways, that is where the Judeo-Christian disjunct happened in history as well. So maybe we can talk about that later if you do have any thoughts on that. But what you were saying about, you don't know the answer in some ways, and you'd be interested to know my answer. I would, unfortunately for the listeners, say the same thing. I don't know the answer. I think that's why we're having this conversation. I mean, the obvious answer could be allow it to be diverse, allow it to be a cultural space for, the uncles. I'm using my own vernacular because in a banterful way, and allow it to be a strictly minimal worship space for the westernized youth. Again, using, what would be said in sort of my community. Or it's by going back to a question, which is, what is there a problem? And if there is, what is the problem? And I think when you ask that question, I mean, to me, as the westernized youth generation, the problem is twofold. One, I feel a level of disjunct and almost feels like an obstacle to go to a mosque in which their expression and their identity is overly cultural. For in a culture which I don't identify with, but also a culture in which they assume I identify with because of the way I look. And this can open up a whole other debate. Maybe we have a discussion we have on identity politics and its place in this world as well, because it's massively relevant to this conversation. But the other problem is, in order for me to feel fulfilled in a space of worship, I would much rather be in a place where I'm there primarily to worship, and I'm not primarily there to find solidarity within my community. I don't feel like I have those issues. And this is, again, why you might understand that this is a generational kind of generational tension within the Islamic or Muslim community, in that, when I had Shahid Salim on the podcast, and he was talking about the need for having the South Asian vernacular preserved, and then on my side, where I said, well, actually it doesn't have much value to me, and therefore why should our future mosques and spaces of worship have that? It's like, that episode, go and watch that if you haven't seen that already, guys, because that explains this disjunct. So for me, just saying, if I ask that question, I would say the problem for me is just being able to fulfill my daily prayers out and about, because I said it's twofold. One is the identity politics aspect. The other side of it, sorry, I didn't mention, is being out and about and functionally just being able to say, okay, it's time to pray. Where can I go? And I'm not having to go into like, the closet, like you say, and do and adapt my praying style. I want to be comfortable in some ways. So like, that's why in my Instagram drawings as well, where I try to, experiment with new spaces of worship, is maybe we could unlock the roofs of buildings. Thinking about public space becomes really interesting here.
Yeah.
So in a way, I'm not answering the question, but I'm thinking out loud that if we ask the question, what is the problem? And at the same time, think about, if for, in the West, we like to obviously stand up for minority rights, but in terms of the majority, right, we have to talk about the majority as well. And I think the majority of people would feel a level of connection with being able to just take a break from the hustle and bustle of life. And in many ways, that is fundamentally what prayer is, right?
I had a thought about this because it's a duality or a phrase that hits me a lot, which is cultural heritage versus cultural baggage. So if you're thinking, like you said, where you came from, you have that understanding of your own history and heritage, which is really great, and some people do feel that, some people feel very disconnected from it. So I think there is validity in saying some form of preservation or understanding is important to carry through. I'm a historian, I'm going to say that, right? And this is the but is the baggage part, right? Which is to say, does it have to stay there though? Do you have to understand it? Do you have to perfectly preserve it in order for it to still carry you as the practicer, as the descendant of these cultural traditions? Do you have to carry it literally forward? And I think, for me, I would like to say no. There are a lot of things we want to go into, and we don't have to, but like you said, proselytizing, like I was saying, colonialism, missionaries, like there are so many things that the historic legacy of Christianity does not center with what I think is how we should live in the world. It doesn't mean that it didn't happen, doesn't mean it's not part of my heritage. It certainly means that I hope I can do better. So if I can say, I acknowledge that, I see that, we can talk about it, but is it what I have to bring forward with me? I think that's a really important conversation. And so for me, that's when I start thinking about, so then what is the essential part? If taking over continents isn't really in my game, that's not the reason why I want to practice a religious tradition. What does that look like? And maybe that's a distinction that's helpful, is saying, what are the things keeping you grounded versus what are the things weighing you down?
I think it's always an extremely smart thing to do in this conversation to ask that fundamental question. And credit to for example, the Sacred Conference and people who are involved in this space, because they do, that is the question that is asked: what is essential? But then if you asked what is essential, it inherently has to do with how people identify themselves, and where that disjunct is usually in the scholarly discourse. Because for example, the disjunct between me seeing myself as part of a let's say Arabicized tradition, as opposed to now thinking of what is a westernized tradition, is there is that conversation is happening right now. And it's like, that makes a lot of people uncomfortable in the, let's say, in the Islamic tradition, because the idea of innovation, and that's not the right way to kind of phrase the word in Arabic, which is bid'ah, but it means essentially corrupting. So corrupting through bringing something which was not there before. And that is a lot of the tension that Muslims have. And it's why I asked you that question about how do you find a place for finding progress for the Orthodox, and your answer was, well, draw on precedent of progression is such a wonderful answer. And you talked about cultural heritage versus cultural baggage, and then you also you talked about the baggage that I suppose the Christian people have of a colonial past. And it's I can relate to that as well, because the Islamic Empire did very similar things, spreading the religion through force, as critics would say it. And there's an incredible discussion you guys need to check out from Jordan Peterson with Muhammad Hijab on his latest podcast. And to really understand the orthodox opinion there, and from from the Western point of view and the kind of the Eastern point of view is incredibly interesting. This is going to be deep and controversial to get into, maybe, but as I said, I want to be completely honest and allow this to be a safe space. It's like we have to come to terms with the bloody past of ancestors in a weird way, right? And there's no hiding from that. And I think it's important to also, for me to say that, yes, I relate to that, because much of the conversation is emphasizing, the white shame associated with those things. But there is also shame on all sides when it comes to the past. And it's one, should we feel that shame to the point in which it perhaps limits us, or the other way of looking at it is, feel that shame to the point where you can learn from the lessons and know how to not make those mistakes again going forward. But then there's another side of it, which, if you listen to the discourse, and, I think it's always good to hear all sides of everything. People would say, well, that's the world we lived in. Mm-hmm. And you come from a historical background and academic. So I would be very interested to know what you know and what you think about the argument that actually, when you look at the Western or the British Empire, I mean, no one needs to try and make the argument that there were no problems and there was no ill intentions and all to do with gaining power and draining resources. But we did also live in a world where it was eat or get eaten. There was no such thing as the modernized democracy that we are blessed to have today, where, any border issues or expansion issues are dealt with through kind of discussion and, democratic processes. Whereas back then it was protect your borders from imminent threat, or expand it in a way that is either going to include people, or you are going to project onto other people. And perhaps that's where the difficulty is. But just your perspective on that argument.
Yeah, I mean, it's really challenging, because you're right. Like, it is a historical process, and there's actually a fellow historian I was talking about this with recently, because we were talking about it in the context of slavery, and there's a lot of really interesting research around reparations and these things that just seem like good things we should do, where it's like, these are terrible historical things that happened. And there are scholars that write about the fact that it wasn't just a racialized slavery in history. It was this is how you dominated people groups, and people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds dominated different people of racial and ethnic backgrounds. It isn't just this group versus that group historically. And what my colleague and I were talking about is that actually what happened is the Enlightenment, we said it was wrong. So before that, it was, this is just the way of the world. And now we started moralizing it. And it's like an existential threat we created that we also should recognize, where it's like, I don't think it's wrong that we recognized, hey, maybe this is a bad thing to do to people. But I think what we need to do is say, so what are we doing about it? And it's like this existential threat, almost in the way that like Darwinianism, Enlightenment theory, all of this stuff of like, we can recognize it, and almost by recognizing it as this bad thing, now we have ways of defining these things that we never did before, but we haven't found ways of solving them, because they are historical issues and historical processes that have been a part of humanity for so long, and in an American context, a conversation here, people throw out the word decolonize all the time. And it's like, here it takes a very specific lens of, there were indigenous peoples on our continent that were displaced, sometimes, in really, really terrible historical processes, so that people coming from Europe who had discovered or experienced really difficult living there could have space to pursue freedom. And I'm not a first generation immigrant. I've been here long enough. I don't have the capacity to go back. There is no, visa process for me to just apply and say, can I go back to Prussia, please? Prussia doesn't even exist. So what do I do with that legacy, right? And I think that's kind of the tension we're in right now, is going, we can see it. You know, we have words now to describe it, but do we have the language to pursue the next thing? And that's a really tough conversation.
It is, and it's so tough for me in particular, because I still don't, I'm going to be completely honest, I still don't find affinity with the kind of the, let me just say that, the leftist discourse on this either, because it's, I mean, if I can word this, it will be good, but I don't know if I can, but I'll try. And it's almost like, yes, I understand that there are a group of people in the Western world who come from a kind of leftist ideology of saying, yes, we feel the pain, we feel the badness of what our legacy and what our past has done, and we now feel like there should be reparations, and we should try and solve and fix things. And the way we're going to do that is by you know, when you think about the way equity works, is by putting people up into positions and giving them support and boosts. And it's almost like the idea of playing a level, you know, creating a level plane for everybody to compete in the kind of capitalistic world we live in is, you know, is that the right approach? Because one way of looking at it, from, if you could in some way understand my perspective, is, you know, I understand my ancestors suffered. I've seen, you know, historical accounts, so read historical accounts, heard the struggles my parents went through. I have also heard of the incredible good fortune, things that allowed globalization to occur abroad. I myself recognize that, you know, I feel grateful to be part of the Western tradition. Let me put it that way, bluntly. And I feel like there are eras and epochs in time in which continents and peoples are at the forefront of progression, and they are the kind of the leading places to be. And there was an Arab empire in which Babylon, which modern day Iraq was the center of all progression. And one could be, there probably were people sat around that time thinking, oh, well, you know, how did we get to this point? There, many people suffered and died. And you could play that game to infinite regress, I believe. And I think, you know, to take this conversation forward, I almost believe that we have to come to terms with a new identity. And that identity is one which is somewhere in the middle, which is something like, wherever you come from, whatever your background is, we need to feel that we are from the same cloth. And I know this is part of, you know, left, you know, the leftist movement, and maybe it's the people on the right who need to kind of get this into their heads more so. But, you know, the aspect of this is what I mean, it's difficult to summarize, but the aspect of, let me just say it bluntly, white people saying now that the way we're going to help you succeed is by giving you more than you need, and by putting the focus on you as individuals and saying, yes, you are part of this group, you are part of the oppressed group, and the way you're going to progress is by owning that identity and saying, yes, we are the people who suffered. I've felt that in the last 5-6 years, where I've been put into the group of the person who came from a difficult background, yet I never felt many of those realities in the way I was raised and the things I went through. Or maybe I did, and I just have a very different way of dealing with it. So in this really crappy way I've explained, maybe it made some sense, that I what I'm trying to hint at is that there's a new identity that we need to find, right? An inclusive identity where we all see ourselves as part of the Western tradition. Because if we don't have that level of feeling that there is a common thread, And what is the common thread between today, people in, you're in America, I'm in England, the Jews, the Muslims, the Hindus, the Christians, there's no place on earth which is as mixed up as these areas right now. What is the common thread? The common thread can only be nationhood, right?
I was gonna say, I think my word was space, but nationhood is interesting and in some ways implies the same, right? Because nationhood is a geographical border, and you could think about this in a transnational way, although obviously government structures do limit that. So it is what it is. But space, like the idea of shared space, and like that's where, again, adaptive reuse, these things of repeating things happening in the same spaces with the same people, with different people, with the boundaries changing slightly, but maybe not as much as we expect, or all of these things where it's like, what is the shared thing? It's the fact that you and I are here. Like that's what's shared. And yes, cultural heritage, cultural baggage, however we phrase that, are a part of who makes us who we are. But is that the limit? And I think that's where the conversation has been sitting, is we're saying that's the limit. We're only who we were. And not even us, like you and me, born in the last few decades. It's, we have to account for every move our ancestors made. And it's not untrue that that's something that's worth considering, but it's perhaps limiting for us to say that's all we can do. And I think,
why do we have to account for every move our ancestors made?
Maybe not every move, but let's say, we are the embodiment in many ways of who came before us. Genetically, if nothing else, the science behind things like generational trauma. I guess something that resonated for me in what you were saying, and it's understandably like an intersectional thing, it's not based on race, but it is based on gender, is I never felt limited about being a mother until people told me what mothers were, and like, oh, if this is the definition and these are all the ways I'm oppressed as a woman, and if these are all the things that I'm not, and I feel much more comfortable as soon as people stop defining that for me and I defined it for myself, right? And I hear in some ways what you're saying within that, which is to say, maybe if you just let me define who I am for myself, that would be a helpful way forward.
And I'm not even saying it in that kind of way.
Right.
I want to say,
not like with attitude, but just
I
like,
love what you're saying. Yeah, because it's such a beautiful way of framing my frustration, which is towards the people who claim to represent and fight for me. And it's like, no, I didn't ask for you to fight for me and define me and put me in your box to progress what you think is the right thing to do.
right.
And this is again why if we can get deep and philosophical, you could talk about the power of the individual, and why I believe in the value of the individual is because this is where the whole progressive conversation is going towards now with intersectionality. It's like, no, we can't define people by gender, race, and religious belief. There is so much more, and it's like, where will that stop? Hopefully it will go so far to the point where people will be like, oh crap, yeah, it is the individual. It's not group identity. Group identity can form, and it is almost like a hovering taxonomy that can never be gone, but there has to be the emphasis placed on the individual and the capacity for the individual. And this is all relevant to our conversation now as well, of when it comes to finding like you said, the things that are essential, those are things that are essential to the individual, which is, I think, whether you're secular, and I want to know what you think, whether you're Jewish or whether you're Hindu, everybody feels the need to detach from the worldly life to some degree. And especially as we move into the metaverse and the virtual realms, we are going to feel that need even more.
Yeah.
Is that the future? Is that what we should be fighting for?
I'm actually really glad you brought virtual like VR into the space, because that is something I want to talk about too in terms of digital reality. But in general, I agree. I think we know the world just continues to get more complicated. That's a historical truism too. It's, the more knowledge we gain, the more we have to deal with. And, how do you reconcile within yourself these things? I promise you, it's not going to be spending more time on Instagram. You're never gonna find that. And there are lots of versions of what that looks like. Again, if secular, sacred, binary, that I don't think is a true binary of people that have religious tradition or not. The search for needing a third space is real. And yeah, I guess to bridge that into digital third space, social media may not be the version, but there might be ways, and there are lots of people who are writing, exploring this, of VR and overlaps within our own reality, creating the ability to have shared space in ways we didn't before. And is our digital world an other world, an after world, all these things, right? Digital memorial. And anyway, there's a whole thing to be explored there. But just this idea again, of how are we creating those spaces and those new experiences that are shared.
So I did see your post recently about, your realization that the importance for virtual space is surprisingly good. We need to have places of which are equally accessible for all. And I think parenthood plays a very interesting kind of contributes that conversation very nicely as well, given that you are a mother, I am a father, and we feel the blessings of being able to perhaps do an interview like this without having to get up and go somewhere. And then, you can pause this and go and attend to your child if you need. So yeah, there's a slight interesting balance of, what is right, what is wrong there, because we know the dangers of virtual space and becoming detached from reality, and what that contributes to the discussion of a sacred space. But we also know of what you're talking about, which is creating something maybe one day we can go and detach from the world in a virtual way, where we're sitting on top of a mountain and connecting to something. And on that note, I actually must admit, I bought one of these recently. It's an Oculus Quest 2, because I'm someone who I don't like to form my opinions or views on things until I've exhausted them in all aspects possible. So I thought, why not? Let me jump into the metaverse and see what it's about. And yeah, it's quite interesting. I mean, my last episode I did, which released today actually, or if you're listening to this, then it would have been several weeks ago. I spoke to one of my close friends, Faisal, who is a co-founder of a metaverse platform called Illusor and all sorts of other architect kind of innovations, about the metaverse and the future roles of architects in the metaverse. And I'd be interested in what you think, because we talked about that when you're in the space, virtual space, you're not constrained by the restrictions of physics. No gravity, no air resistance, no pollution even. So no concerns to be had there either. Right. You said you think there'd be something quite interesting about the virtual space. What do you think? How do you think the virtual world could be of kind of future relevance to this conversation?
Well, again, as a third space, to your point.
Sorry, can you define third space as well?
So third space, yeah, it's like a actual term that's used to describe this. I didn't just make it up. I'm not that clever. So it's something that's not home and it's not work. So it's like that third place that you can exist, that usually you're somewhat detached from your daily duties. So pubs could be third spaces, a bowling alley, whatever that thing is, that's like this place. And it's something during COVID that a lot of people missed, because it was saying, I only exist in my home and or work, and all the third spaces were closed. The best we could do is parks, if you had access to those, and parks being another example of third spaces. So they're just these things that have less defined terms about what our role is, so that we can feel a little more free and detached to just engage. And so, religious buildings have often functioned as third spaces, even if you're not there for religious practice. Some of my favorite churches no longer exist as churches and only exist as cafes, but just like walking in and the space itself just kind of lets you detach, right? And so that would be the third space, is saying, I don't have these duties, these things that I always have in the back of my head right now, and I can just focus on being. And so, that is so important for our mental health as humans to have that, right? Like, that's not something limited to religious experience. Again, like, if you want to look for commonalities in a sacred secular kind of spectrum, just that place is important. So, again, the digital realm does function as that when it has its positive attributes. It definitely has negatives too. But think about, like, what does a transcendental experience in a virtual space look like? Because, and I know you saw the video Adam made where we were talking about portable Islam, but it was kind of similar, where it's this idea of portal, right? Like, what has religious tradition offered? In addition to maybe a lot of moralizing things, it does in many ways offer the ability for transcendence, to just say there's more than this moment you're sitting in. Wouldn't it be great to think about that? Because there's so much in life that you may not want to be focusing on, that could be really negative, that could be all of these things. And so, unlocking that experience has had a lot of historical ways. And, again, thinking about how are we doing that going forward? Well, if I can't architecturally express to you how a Catholic grandma and, a Muslim uncle sit in the same space because they just won't, or, whatever, could we create that third space digitally? And is that like a low-hanging fruit of an entrance point? Saying you don't have to change anything about your life yet. Just look at this and then think about it.
Oh, you're giving me ideas. Because my quest, as you probably realized, is how do we, what was it? I wrote it down. Well, I should know it, right? Which is that how do we take away the need for precedent for the orthodox? And your response to that was by giving them precedent of progression and therefore opening them up to it. But then there's this other answer you've just given me, which is ease them into it through the metaverse.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting.
Dream, yeah.
It's really interesting because whatever my personal view is, I think it's worth exploring whatever innovations we have at the moment to see how we can progress. And you talked about that Muslim uncle and the Christian grandma sat together, and maybe they connect in a virtual space, which is quite a funny vision. But I just think that image in of itself, thinking of I'm thinking of an uncle with the big white beard and a walking stick and wearing a thobe and a hat, sat next to a Christian grandma who would be wearing all of her symbolic clothes, and looking at, maybe let's place a Jewish old man in there as well. And it's like that vision of those three people sat in a space where they're contemplating what they all believe to be the higher purpose and the higher being is an aspiration worth going for, I believe. And us trying to figure out what that is through these difficult discussions is something I'm really glad we've started, and I hope we can continue to do on a regular basis, because we've just scratched the surface. Because as you see, guys, these things bring up everything else. These are very difficult conversations to navigate, I must admit as well. I think that should bring us to an end. I loved that conversation. What do you have any kind of thoughts? How do you think that chat went? Is there anything else you want to say?
The problem is I have a lot more we could say. So I think to your point, no.
Let me end it by just saying, Let me just end it by asking, again, unfortunately, another question is one approach to the question of how do we, what is the future of the sacred spaces. One approach, as we said, is to just allow for that diversity. But if you were to say and describe something that everybody could relate to and everybody could take part in, what do you think that is in any shape or form that you wish to describe it in? Even if you said it in one word or sentence, I'd be happy with it. Or you spent 5 minutes explaining it.
Is this architecturally or just otherwise?
Whatever you want.
Whatever I want. I think invitational is my word. I think if there are a lot of things you look at in historic processes, like I said, it's a lot of things that you could really focus on negatives. And for me, I think where a lot of the breakdown happens is people feeling welcomed and invited without agenda. And so, if we work towards creating things that are genuinely invitational, not with agendas, not with the expectation that somebody is here to change who they are. Maybe that's a really good way we can just start conversations and create space that is meaningful for everyone.
100%. And we can include in that, just so everybody knows, we're not talking just about the Abrahamic traditions. We're talking about the secular, we're talking about, every denomination here. And the idea of a worship space with quotation marks that nobody has seen before or nobody has defined before is so exciting. And once again, Rebekah, thanks so much. I really hope we can talk again. So yeah, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Hamza.
All right, guys, we'll see you guys in the next episode.